Thank you so much for having us.
Is there anything you both would like to say before we get into the questions?
Yeah, that's actually, so Meg was actually one of the funders of the Schmidt Future Stools competition. So it's a little odd for me to be in a panel with her.
No, I think it's so fun. Aashna is one of the people that we highlight as kind of one of the wonderful people that came out of the competition. So it's really fun to be on a call with you.
Yeah, same here.
Oh, that is amazing. All right. So my first question to the both of you is, so, even before we get into your journey, can you just, let's start with Meg. Can you guys throw some light on what learning engineering is?
Sure. So, I think there's a lot of definitions of learning engineering. The one that we, and when I say we, I kind of mean the learning agency and Schmidt Futures, which is one of our main clients, is we really think about learning engineering as kind of the blending of both learning sciences and computer science. So how do you use kind of the robust data sets that we have now to really mine that data and make sense of what works for what students in what situations. So, I think some people see learning engineering kind of outside the data realm, and we see it really kind of like when we think of a learning scientist, when we think of a learning engineer, we think of someone who's really bilingual in both learning science and computer science.
Sorry. Yeah. What about you, Aashna? Would you like to add on to what Meg said?
Yeah, definitely. So I think she framed it perfectly. Like, it's taking the best from the learning sciences, neuroscience, psychology, cognitive science, and converging it with emerging technology to, drive better educational outcomes for everyone. So I think learning engineering, what attracted me to that field specifically is that it's honorable to the fact that research and pedagogy comes through the learning sciences, and technology is the catalyst as opposed to the product in the sense. So technology is used to ameliorate learning outcomes, but the research is kind of focused in the psychology and learning sciences. So I really like that part of learning engineering.
Right. Okay, that's amazing. I'm glad that now all the attendees here have a broad sense of what we're trying to talk about, because, it's an emerging field. Not everyone even knows what learning engineering is. So that's great. My next question to the both of you, if you guys could just share a little bit more about your background, say what subjects you took up in your schooling, your graduation, your further studies. And this time we'll start with Aashna. And along with that question, if you could also tell us, why you chose to do a graduation in psychology. So yeah, we'll start with Aashna first.
Sure. So I'm, again, an international student from India, and I recently graduated actually just a month back from Pomona College. And I majored in psychology with a focus on child development. And most recently, as Arushi described in her intro, I raised some funding through Schmidt Futures to pilot this early numeracy app. So my major interest lies in the intersection of education and technology. And I felt like psychology and computer science were the best ways to kind of leverage that and pursue my field in a way. And what drew me to psychology in college was definitely my professors. Like Pomona offered me a wide array of researchers, professors, and mentors who could guide me through the process. And just coming from a liberal arts background, CS classes were rooted in human contexts. So they always urged us to solve real problems or, design projects that would serve humanity in some way, shape, or form. And as a result, this numeracy app that I created was a part of my senior thesis. And it was very much like grounded in my educational experience. And, that's why I chose to pursue such an eclectic and disciplinary field.
All right. And what about you, Meg? So you've done your graduation in American Studies. So why did you choose to do that?
Yeah, well, I think Aashna was far more strategic than I was. I mean, the real answer is, I think the funny thing is everyone's like, what do you want to be when you grow up, when you're younger? And I still don't totally know the answer to that. And yet I'm like, mid-career at this point. So I went to Georgetown. I didn't really know exactly what I wanted to be. I was thinking of being a lawyer. and I was more guided by like what courses were really interesting to me. I studied American Studies, which is a number of universities have it now, and it's basically a really interdisciplinary major. So usually you take a certain progression of courses, but then you can just like take whatever you want. And that was really interesting to me. And I actually was minor in psychology and ended up taking a lot of different psychology courses, was thinking a lot about getting a PhD in psychology and didn't do that. But so it was really kind of by my interest that I worked in. I wrote my senior thesis on basically the intersection between law and neuroscience. And so have always been really interested in the brain, but I did Teach for America, which I think there's a Teach for most countries now. So I did Teach for America. And I really thought I would then probably go do something else. And I just got really invested in education and, have thought about, I think I'll always be interested in education. I don't totally know long-term where that will take me. But I ended up working in policy after the classroom. And, I am just fascinated by looking at the money that the federal government, especially in America, spends on education, and really how little we spend on research compared to what like the research and development we spend on agriculture or energy. There's just far less concentration and investment in education R&D. And I'd always kind of thought about this, but hadn't really kind of did some more like leadership development work. And about 3 years ago, started working at the learning agency. And I think got far more, because of another project we're working on, got far more invested in kind of like just building robust data sets, and saw how difficult it was. And then like just got a glimpse on how much data there is, and the fact that like we just don't use it at all. Going back to my policy world, like the federal government sits on so much data and they basically don't use it. And so I think it's just fascinating to see like how far we've come in other areas, in other disciplines, and yet how limited our R&D is in education, largely because of privacy rights and all sorts of things related to education data. And, my background is not technical, but I've had the opportunity to work with philanthropic organizations and doing a lot of work to kind of promote this learning engineering work, and just see how really transformative it is, because in a sense, we have to educate people, change policy in order to ensure that we can actually learn from the data that's out there, and also build the talent pipeline. I think right now, most people who come out of school with a computer science degree go to other disciplines for a lot of reasons. They're just not great data sets in education, and there's not a lot of money in that space. And so to really kind of look at this whole problem, it's this meld of like, how do we build the leaders in learning engineering? How do we make sure the data is available? It's kind of the things that I love. Like, it's just, how do we tackle this problem to make sure that we have the talent and money and data to really make this field something that a lot of people want to go into.
Right. And I think it's also amazing how people from completely different backgrounds, like, you have a background of psychology, you have a background of, the brain. You said that your thesis was about the brain and like neuroscience and law. And there are people that come in with the degree of, say, data science, computer science, and you can come in with completely different degrees, but still reach, the same point that, okay, we want to really change, or we want to make some change in the education policies, and we want to create a difference. So I think it's amazing how, people, that also increases the amount of perspectives you have when you're sitting down to make these policies, or when you're sitting down to actually impact education. So I think that's fascinating, and it's really good. My next question to the both of you is going to be, how did you develop an interest in learning engineering? And did you always know that you wanted to pursue a career in this field? We'll start with Meg first.
I feel like I kind of answered that already. So I'm trying to see if I have anything else to add. No, I think that's the great thing that I'll say this one thing is kind of like a call to action to everyone is that I don't think you have to exactly know what you want to do. I'm a perfect example of that. And I think the most important thing is just to like think about how you build these transferable skills that matter across industries, and you know, don't get totally focused on like planning out your future, because I do think there's just like there's so much room for shifting. So that's the only thing I'll add.
Yeah, I kind of second that, because learning engineering for me was a coincidence. Like I didn't even know that was a field till last year when I was actually applying for Schmidt Futures, because that was the competition title. So it's like, do you want to be a learning engineer, or are you interested in the field? And I was like, what is the field, you know? So that was kind of my experience getting into it. So I had no idea actually that there was a specific niche for it. And I just happened to like both the CS, so the technical side, and psychology. So yeah.
That's amazing. That's amazing. Okay. My next question to you is, okay, this is a very interesting and broad question. How do you think STEM will progress in the coming years? Aashna, you can go first.
Wow. Yeah, that's a very loaded question. So I guess we can think about it in two ways. You know, one is from a policy level and one is from the individual level. So in terms of policy, economy, systems, there's obviously a major skill gap. Like everyone is looking for someone who has a technical background, either as an engineer or a computer scientist or something like that. And wages and pay is always higher in STEM versus non-STEM fields. So in the next few years, I think that will still persist given the dearth of talent that's coming in. And although a lot of universities, apps, edtech companies are pushing on the skills, there's still a major gap that needs to be filled. So for the next few years, I still think this gap will persist. Additionally, especially from the West, there's this whole idea of women in STEM. And, you know, as Himanshi also has her own STEM4Girls platform, that's also an emerging trend that's coming about, and it's been there for a while. So I feel like that will persist in a big way. And what's coming up now, I feel like, is the inherent biases that exist in STEM, not just from the people who are employed, but in the data sets themselves. So I'm sure Meg can attest to this, that, you know, a lot of big data is biased against races, biased against races, not racists, and against women. And, you know, how do you fix those things? And how do you develop algorithms and data structures that recognize that they're biased in some way and, you know, solve for that? So I feel like from policy level, that's where it's going to go. And then in an individual sense, especially because of the national education policy in India, for example, there's going to be a lot of push for learning these STEM skills very early on. So even companies like White Hat Junior in India, et cetera, are kind of pushing people at a very young age to explore these skills. And at the base of all STEM skills, I think, is creativity and curiosity. So the minute you start developing those skills, you know, you're set for any path. So I feel like, yeah, a lot of individuals will be persuaded to join those fields. That's my take.
Right. What about you, Meg? How do you think STEM is going to progress in the upcoming years?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's so many different ways. I think I think one thing that's just been interesting, especially in the US, is there's been such a focus on like those hard skills, like let's get everyone to code. And I think that that is just gonna, like, the needs of like what we need in a workforce is going to change from like a lot of AI will just, coding will be easier. So we'll need people with more strategic, creative thinkers rather than kind of the hardcore coders. So I think my biggest fear in terms of this is that, like, we have been traditionally in the education space, we have not been able to keep pace with like the demands. And so I almost feel like we are a decade, we're now where we should have been like a decade or more ago, and we're teaching people coding skills, which is all well and great, but I think we need to actually think higher now. Like, how do we like think at a much different level so that people can think about how to use that and analyze the data and all of that. So I think I think it's just going to be very interesting. I think there's going to be a lot of like shifts at the policy and like vision level of what STEM looks like. And I really hope, and I really do hope that that is, that education shifts to reflect that. There has not been a great record of that, at least in the States. And so I think it will be really interesting to see how much we respond to the difference, the needs of the workforce, because I think the workforce is on this different path than where we see the education states and standards are going.
Right, that makes a lot of sense. And I think, but it's also like great that coding has become this accessible. I remember when I had started out coding, I was in the 9th grade and I was pretty skeptical about it. And nowadays, like, you know, like Aashna mentioned, these apps like CodeLQ and White Hat Junior. I mean, there are kids making apps, like it's crazy, which is, I mean, it's great that kids are getting this kind of exposure so early on. So yeah, I hope it, you know, continues to progress. And next point was really important, that there is a certain gap which needs to be filled, wherein, you know, we're talking about the workforce and the education. So I hope that happens soon. Those were two very great answers. Thank you. My next question to you guys is, so both of you have done internships and jobs in the edtech sector. And since learning engineering is an emerging field, what all were you involved in to keep, you know, honing your skills in this field? And can you just throw some light on, say, specific jobs or internships that were really important in your career or in your growth? Yeah, we'll start with Meg.
Yeah. So it's interesting. About a week ago, we hosted a panel, or hosted like a workshop at the Education Data Mining Conference, and the recordings are available, which I would definitely recommend watching, because I think we explore a lot of these issues. And you know, a lot of the panelists talked about that, while the technical skills are key, it's kind of like there are the other things too. So it's like, how creative are you? How good of a communicator are you? You know, just like, how flexible are you? So I think I can't totally speak to the technical piece, because, you know, I think you probably all can code. I cannot, far from it. So, but I would say that when I have interviewed people for jobs, and I have hired people who have like far more technical experience than I do, I asked someone else to navigate and kind of evaluate their technical skills, because I'm just not in a place to really to be able to assess that. But I would say it's hard to find someone who has, like, there's some like technical amazing people, and then when you ask them to like think outside the box and you know, like put a memo together that's more of a creative thinking memo, they kind of freeze up. And so when I think it's like really important to kind of build the muscles in both areas, kind of that creative thinker and communication. I think if you can write a strong paper, no matter what career you go into, you are highly desirable. I think writing is like the key thing that kind of crosscuts any job, at least what I've seen. So I think when you're looking for a career, or you're looking for an internship or a job, I do think that kind of like transferable nature, you know, if you have a really technical job internship one time, like push yourself to have a less technical one the next. I think it's kind of about that shifting. So, you know, I don't think there's any like one internship that's going to like make or break your future. I think it's much more about kind of making yourself a diverse, adaptable candidate.
Right, basically getting a lot of exposure and having experience in both the fields, rather than, you know, being an expert at, say, the technical side. So yeah, that makes a lot of sense. What about you, Aashna?
Yeah, I think if I had to sum it up in a sentence, I'd say like being open to unlearning what you know, and then constantly relearning and adapting to new situations. Because, you know, I'm, like I told you, I graduated last month, so I've not worked in a job per se. I've done a lot of internships. And I think the one thing that always helped me was just being receptive to what are the needs out there, at a company level or at my manager's level or even at the community level, and seeing what I can do to solve those problems. So just asking really great questions and presenting your ideas in a very articulate and evidence-backed manner. I think that's something that's really helped me succeed in my internships. And I feel like for any field, whether it's technical or non-technical, those skills will take you far.
Right, all right, that was amazing. Okay. Can you both tell us about the careers in learning engineering? And we already, like I mentioned, a bunch of backgrounds that you can have to get into the field, but what are the possible backgrounds one can have to get into the field of learning engineering? So we'll start with Aashna first.
I would actually defer to Meg because she's making the hiring decision. She knows the careers so much better than I do. So I'm going to let her take this one.
Yeah, I mean, I think because it's such a diverse field, like it's almost like anything. I mean, I think traditionally it's the background is like psychology and computer science are the two kind of majors that are easy fits. But to kind of get to that technical piece, again, I kind of fell into it more through the policy side. But I would say like really being that bilingual person that we desperately need in both areas. I do think like computer science and psychology are two like tracks that make a lot of sense. So I'd say Aashna is like you're the perfect example.
But if you want to put a title on it, I guess it would be like someone who works in product management, not necessarily as a technical product manager, but just a general one. I feel like that pretty much sums up learning engineering as a career, I would say.
I think you can be it as an academic. I think you can be it as in industry. I think at least, for instance, on this conference, we had people who were from the industry, from academics, and from government. And I think those are kind of three tracks that you can think about. But academia and industry, I do feel like are quite different, but and I think the cultures are quite different of the three sectors. But when I talk to professors who are looking for a postdoc, they're competing for the same candidates that are for companies that I'm talking to who are looking for talent. So I think that like the same candidates are attractive at all of the different sectors.
All right. Makes sense. Okay. So there's no definitive, career that we're talking about, or, not definitive position. Or, I mean, is there, like Aashna mentioned, product management? Of course, there's, like Meg mentioned, industry and academia and all that. Is there, a certain career per se, or like a certain position designation wise that people that are interested in learning engineering should look for when they're applying?
Maybe like a learning designer or an interactive designer in a way. I think because they get the best of both, right? Like you speak to users, you empathize with them. So that's where like if you're designing, for example, like an edtech product, so you're understanding what their needs are from an educational standpoint, that's where the cognitive science, psychology piece comes in. And then the designing piece would be the CS, or even like the iterating based on data would be the CS part. I would say that, or maybe even like a data analyst for a specific education tech company, or even a business analyst for that matter. It just depends which sector you're in. But basically the skills of psychology and computer science are very interdisciplinary, and they can be used in a variety of contexts. So anything dealing with data and people would be the right job for a learning engineering person, I'd say.
Right.
And I would say one thing that's like, if you're looking to kind of get experience in this, you don't have to land like the perfect internship. I think there's one place that we have seen drives a lot of people to the field of learning engineering are Kaggle competitions or hackathons. I think that they are, interestingly, my organization is working on designing a number of Kaggle competitions because there have been far less education-focused Kaggle competitions in kind of the history of the space. And there was one back in 2012 called the Automated Student Assessment Prize, which looked at grading student essays, automated graded student essays. And it pulled some of the most prominent now, like learning engineers in the US were the top winners of that competition, and literally had no interest in education prior to winning, but just were really good at what they did, and then ended up just, you know, getting this great algorithm and then using it to build like a really strong name for themselves in the field. And so I think if you're interested in this, I think you can really start small and like dabble on Kaggle. And you know, I think there's lots of ways to engage. And I think that is particularly really interesting to employers and everyone like that. Like we were hiring some interns recently around learning engineering, and we saw a couple people who were just like really prominent in Kaggle. And I honestly have no idea how they scored or like on the leaderboard. But we were like, that's awesome. Like literally in their spare time, they're going on Kaggle. And that was really attractive to us because it just showed passion. So I think that there's like so many different ways to get into it. And there's also so many ways to just demonstrate your interest, even if the specific job you're in isn't completely aligned to learning engineering.
Right. I think that is an amazing answer. Thank you. Coming to diversity and inclusion in EdTech or learning engineering. So how do you feel about the underrepresentation of women in STEM? And have you ever faced any gender discrimination? So in STEM or at jobs, internships, and anything like that? Please start with Meg first.
Yeah, I mean, I think where I see this so much is just in hiring. Like it is fascinating just to see honestly how many white men are applying for jobs and how hard it is to find a diverse candidate pool. And so I myself have I think I've been very lucky in kind of I think coming up more in like the education space. It is very women focused rather than the engineering space. So I think like early on in my career, I didn't necessarily see that. And when I kind of made the merge more into the ed tech space, I was more at the mid-career level. So I didn't necessarily have I don't feel like I necessarily got a lot of had as many of the feelings that potentially could have happened in an earlier career. That said, like, I do still think like as a woman, sometimes I'm in a room with, in a Zoom with all men, and a man will like say the same thing I said. And I'm like, I just said that, okay. So I do think it's just like, it happens, but also like a woman will do that too. So I think sometimes it's more personality wise or position wise. So, I think it's just, I do feel like I have seen that there's like a much, companies are now like really focused on diversifying their work, their organizations, which I find really heartening. And I think there is, and this is one of the things our organization is doing, is like a push to really build the pipeline. And a real attention to diversity to do that. So I think there's more progress being done in this, but I think there's obviously more work to be done.
Absolutely. Yeah, Aashna, what about you?
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. Like there is definitely an underrepresentation. And this is slightly off topic, but one statistic that I read a while ago, so I don't know how it's changed, is that in India, if you look at a medical or a biomedical or anything in the biology space, you can see that there's an equal distribution of men and women. Like there are 48% female doctors, 52% male doctors, something like that. But the minute you take it to like a CS or an engineering, that parity is no longer there. It becomes like 70-30 or 80-20. So that's also something that I find really weird. And especially in learning engineering, where again, it's too new to have like large level statistics on, but in terms of like Schmidt Futures or the tools competition, I saw that there was pretty much a balanced diversity. So I personally haven't faced any sort of discrimination in the workplace on the basis of my gender, but I have noticed that there are obviously more male applicants than there are female. So yeah, I don't know, from an Indian perspective, it's slightly more nuanced than the West. And that's just something interesting to consider.
Absolutely, absolutely, yeah. And along with that data point that you mentioned that, it's almost equal, it's also that at your say graduation level, there are a lot of women that do subjects like biology, chemistry, or, mix and match of both of them. Where do they go when it comes to the jobs? That's something we really need to think about. We're talking about 48% or any statistic, like let's consider an equal statistic, like 50-50 men and women. But whenever it comes to jobs, even in sectors like biology and chemistry, there are very less women as compared to men. So we, yes, like you mentioned, it's very nuanced, but we need to look into these.
Oh, definitely, yeah, 100%.
Answer these questions. Yeah, great. Thank you so much. This will be my last question to the both of the panelists, which means that after I ask this question, the audience members are allowed to ask the panelists questions. You guys can just type it down in the chat box and I will recognize them one by one. So my last question to the both of you is there any final piece of advice you would like to give to us budding girls and boys in STEM? So yeah, we'll go with Meg first.
I think my biggest thing is, and sorry, I didn't look at the questions well enough before because I feel like I would have had a better, a more compelling piece of advice. But I will say that like when I think about like the gender discrimination or just like the gender difference, I think one of the biggest things is just like confidence, and that is such a hard thing. But as you guys are pursuing your careers, I do think like a lot of this is like, far more than you think you do. Some of this is in life in general is fake it till you make it. And so I would say that like, if you're having any questions or doubts or like, am I qualified for this? Am I the right things for this? Like, just like the answer is yes. And you just do it. And if you're not quite there yet, like you fake it till you make it. And so, but that's literally like half of what the workforce is that there's a point that you just learn on the fly. So I would say that like, as you're thinking more about pursuing whatever it is you're going to pursue, I think you just need to kind of like, if you're ever questioning yourself, just know that like everyone else is, and you just kind of like keep focusing on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. I guess for me, it would be just like keep solving problems because, with the way technology has progressed and the access we have to tools, it's become so much easier for people in the technical field to just go out there and create and solve. And there are a million problems out there. So I don't know. I guess my piece would just be to like experiment with what you know and like push yourself to find a passion and solve problems for everyone. I guess that would be my advice.
All right. Thank you so much for both